Well, I think there are certainly possibilities for positive cooperation between the U.S. and China. The question is, in what issue areas would they be willing to or able to cooperate at the present time? And at the moment, I think there are actually relatively few. The United States has moved away from the Paris Climate Control Agreement, and climate was one of the major areas in which the two countries cooperated under President Obama. In trade, even if there is a temporary trade agreement, which seems likely perhaps between Presidents Trump and Xi Jinping, the trade disagreements between China, I think, are much deeper, and therefore it's going to be a complicated issue going forward. There are areas of security. I think basically the two countries are in agreement about North Korea's nuclear program, for example, so I imagine there will be some level of cooperation there. But in many areas where China and the United States used to cooperate at the global level, I think the cooperation is going to be much more difficult going forward for reasons of change in both China and the United States. Well, people use different words for the relationship. At one end is enemy and adversary, and then competitor and rival. And I think it's difficult to imagine the United States and China are going to be close cooperators and allies, or even friends. I think the people of China and the people of the United States can be friendly and collaborative and cooperative with one another, but the governments, I think, are on relatively divergent paths at the present time. So I think competitor actually would be a fairly positive way of thinking about the relationship, as opposed to some of the more negative terms that could be used at the current time, like adversary or rival or enemy. So I think, yes, they are competitors to a degree, but you can have friendly competition and peaceful competition without having military competition or military conflict of some kind. So I'd have to disagree with the ambassador in the sense that I think competition probably is accurate for the United States and China. And the point is not to let that competition to get out of control and to see that it's restrained, and in areas that are relatively positive for both sides, like economics, technology, and the like. But even there, the possibility for things to become much more dangerous and much more negative, I think, are certainly present in the current moment. Well, I think it's important to note, especially for Chinese audiences, that the mood and the general perceptions in the United States, and this includes the general foreign policy community, but also the political class, and especially the China experts, have moved in a much more pessimistic direction in the last year and two. And we can talk about the many reasons for that, but I don't think the prospects for the immediate future in 2019 are going to be very positive. I think what we can hope to do is keep things on a reasonably even track, continue negotiations on outstanding points like trade, which are extremely important, and continue talking, negotiating with one another on issues that are outstanding. But I think the view in the United States now has definitely moved several moves over in the negative direction in terms of what the expectation is for U.S.-China relations. Mm-hmm. Well, it's hard to imagine, and I am not an expert on the Chinese economy, but I do try to follow it. And my sense among the experts on the Chinese economy is that the slowing is likely to continue for demographic reasons, because the Chinese population is plateauing and the workforce is actually declining. The numbers in the workforce are declining. The trade tensions and the tariffs clearly are not helping. And one of our prominent economic specialists on China, Nicholas Lardy, has recently written a book which suggests that the growth of the state sector and its importance in the Chinese economy is part of the reason that Chinese growth has slowed and probably will continue to slow. Because the impetus for growth in China has largely been in the private sector, and the private sector is being squeezed. It's being squeezed financially, it's being squeezed by other policies, and it doesn't impress me that there's much sign that that's being reversed. So I think we can expect, at best, the current levels of growth and quite possibly slower growth going forward.
measure?
Well, you're right. It certainly it took off extremely well. I think at the beginning there was an exaggeration of how large it was going to be, how quickly it was going to move. Um, the reports that I have seen about the actual projects that are associated with the Belt and Road demonstrate that it is become somewhat scattered. In other words, the original belt and the original road now look like a map of dots with projects in many, many countries that are fairly far away from the belt and the road. But the main issue is the one you alluded to, which is that there has been a considerable amount of pushback, not only pushback from the United States and some European countries about the implications of the Belt and Road and how it might be used by China for influence in other countries, but also from many countries that have accepted Belt and Road projects and have discovered that they cannot finance them, and they were not negotiated in a transparent way, and they now have had political changes which have brought to power governments that are quite skeptical of some of the projects in the Belt and Road. So the big example perhaps is Malaysia, but also the Maldives in the Indian Ocean have had a recent change, Sri Lanka earlier, and there's been some concern expressed by international agencies about the indebtedness problem that could be produced by the Belt and Road. Now, to be fair, the Belt and Road has also produced advantages for many countries. It has built infrastructure that's needed, and there's no the indebtedness of many of these countries is not associated only with China and Chinese lending, but also with other lending from other parties, including the United States and Western countries. Nevertheless, I think the view of the Belt and Road is now a much more skeptical one. And I think, leaving apart the attitude of the United States, I think many of the countries that are partners with China in the Belt and Road are going to take a much more cautious view of these projects because they are concerned about the long-term economic and financial indebtedness that would result or could result from these projects. So another example would be Pakistan, which is a very close friend of China's, but actually has taken a somewhat cautious stance recently about these projects. And Pakistan, I believe, is the largest Belt and Road partner at the moment with China. So, well, the temptation is going to be to loosen monetary policy and increase credit when the economy slows. And if the economy starts to slow dramatically, that will be even more of a temptation. And the People's Bank, the central bank of China, is in fact not an independent central bank. It responds to political signals and political directives. And so if the central leadership in China believes the economy is slowing too much, there will certainly be an effort for the People's Bank to pump up credit and improve the economic growth prospects. The danger of that is, of course, on the indebtedness side of the Chinese economy, and particularly private business in China. And the government and the central bank have been very concerned about that as well. So in many ways, they're in something of a dilemma that the instrument that they would normally use to increase short-term economic growth is one that they really don't want to use because of what it would do to the levels of indebtedness in the economy. And that presents them with some serious problems, especially when other sources of growth like exports may be hampered by trade conflict and the like. Well, this future, you mean, would it look more like the United States?
Yes, like have a more constant and more stable economic growth rate, including GDP.
Well, China's had a fairly constant economic growth rate. It's been slowing, but it's been slowing pretty gradually if we are to believe the government statistics. And I think most people take them as roughly where China's economy is. So I think the expectation is China, without a major financial crisis, China will continue to grow faster than the United States will on average. The United States economy has been growing above its trend in the last year or two, but it had a very slow recovery from the economic crisis in 2008, 2009. So to say the US is more stable, I mean, we had a very large crisis in 2008, 2009, and really the last decade has been recovering from that. And I don't hope, I certainly hope that China doesn't have that future of financial crisis and then having to recover from it because it's very costly. Whether China will have the economic instruments that the US has to manage its economy, I think all of the economies right now have a problem with economic management in the sense that they are not performing to expectations in their populations in various ways. In the US, the question of inequality has gotten much larger. And the question of whether the current growth rate can be maintained with a fiscal deficit that's very large and with a government debt that's growing fairly rapidly. So there are many issues confronted by the advanced industrialized economies. For China, I think the big issue is if its growth slows, can China grow rich before it grows old? I mean, that's the big medium-term to long-term concern. And does China have the right policies in place to see that it does continue on the track toward becoming a richer country in the future, like the United States? But lots of questions, I think, for both countries.
Okay, that'll be all for an interview.
Okay,
Appreciate
great.
your time.
All right. Good.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Answers are really awesome.
Thank you.